Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast. On this week's episode, we have two short stories that engage with how the mind, and often madness, can connect itself to the supernatural. In other words, two short stories that populate the subgenre of psychological horror. The first story in this episode has been taken from our 2020 collection, Footsteps in the Dark, and is a prime example of a modern psychological horror story. This is He Will Hear Us Coming by Anna Ziegelhof.
In my memory, my father's hall had not been quite so desolate. When I returned after 4 years, the house lay dark in the middle of the brown, wintry meadow. The piercing wind from the North Sea tore at me when I was led inside, held tightly by the gruff housekeeper on one side and my stepmother on the other. My stepmother had chattered pleasant nonsense throughout the journey, but I had seen the disdain she was trying to hide from me. I had seen it in the tight lines around her mouth, in the distracted flitting of her eyes as the landscape outside the carriage had grown more rural. Somebody had begun to heat the ancestral hall by the sea, but the warmth was still helpless against years of disuse. I was shown to my room as if I couldn't remember the way. Rest had been recommended, but in this room, the room from which I had been carried 4 years ago, screaming in terror, my silly pictures were still there. My dolls were there. Their empty, cheerful faces were still staring into the void. The 4-poster bed had been made up for me. Only the books had been cleared off the shelves. They had left ghostly marks in the dust. That stranger who had intruded into my life nearly unbeknownst to me during my absence, my father's new wife, my stepmother, had clearly followed orders. I had been diagnosed with an active imagination. Reading, they had said all along, was too strenuous. It would upset my injured mind. That's where all those noises had come from, they said, from my active imagination. After I had learned to keep quite still and to say exactly what they wanted to hear, they discharged me from the institution, and not even my father's well-meaning protest could change their verdict. I was cured. For the first time in 4 years, I went home to my father's neglected hall by the sea. My stepmother reminded me to rest. My father would join us for dinner, and then I was left alone in that terrible room. Of course, a story about a little girl left alone in a haunted room came back to me. I shook it off. I was, after all, an 18-year-old woman, not a little girl. But that only reminded me of yet another story. This atrocious nursery. And so the stories shouted at me. In me, a tight ball of rage formed and came out as a suppressed grunt. I swallowed it quickly and spent the afternoon gazing out of the window across the soggy meadow from which that infernal, eternal fog rose. My father sat down with us for dinner in the large wood-panelled dining room that, like everything else, seemed to have shrunk slightly in the years of my absence. He boomed anecdotes of travel and business through the room, and then he announced his departure for France the next morning, leaving his problem, me, as an occupation for his new wife. I had learned a lot during my time in the hospital: to observe, to contain violence, to smile, to be docile. I had learned everything about fear. Not even fear of the noises in the walls, but fear of repercussions for honesty. So I smiled and said, Thank you." The wintry evening drew on, my stepmother observing me between stitches of her needle, and as bedtime drew closer, I realized that 4 years of absence had not relativized my memories of the reason I had been sent away in the first place. There was a violent presence that haunted my father's cliff-top hall, but I had little hope that it had given up and left. I expected that it would continue its attacks on me. It would finally drag me down into its hellish haunts. I grew more and more certain of it as the evening drew on. Of course, I had been taught it had all been in my head, a hysterical reaction to the death of my mother. I had been taught to recite that explanation meekly. I had recited it so often and so convincingly that I was discharged with only a recommendation for rest, despite my father's outspoken doubt about my recovery. My reluctant stepmother, grudgingly following her orders, walked me back up to my childhood room after an appropriate amount of time had been spent by us, silently occupied with needlework in the drawing room. Exhausted, not from travel but from holding a strained smile, from the thought of inactivity and boredom and aimlessness, I fell asleep in my old bed, its curtains drawn. I started from first delirious slumber to the familiar rustling sound, the mice in the walls. I had known that it was going to be back, because I knew it had never been in my head. All those lovely stories that my mother had always shared with me had nothing at all to do with it. The mice in the walls, I had been taught to say to myself. Little had they known that I had recited their lines and nodded diligently, without even once believing them. In the dark, in my familiarly haunted room, I grinned to myself and put quotation marks around the mice in the walls. The second sound came next. I expected it. I had told the police and the doctors all about it. I had been eloquent about it, as eloquent as a 14-year-old could be. In those moments of first slumber, I had explained to them in a very rational tone, I awaken again because of a noise, a soft rustling at first, not as even as the wind, much closer. It grows to a scratching, and next, predictably, the scraping sound of fingernails against wood. "And this was inside the wall, behind your bed?" the men in their dark uniforms or white coats had asked me, with eyebrows raised in amusement at the silly 14-year-old who was taking the death of her mother too hard. "Yes," I had responded. "Somebody is walking around inside the wall and they are scratching the panels with their fingernails. There." I had pointed to the headboard of my 4-poster bed. I was young then. I had not yet learned to read the expressions of arrogant patronization and amused belittlement. Silly me. I had shared so eagerly, thinking somebody had finally come to help me with my abject fear in those nights after my mother's death. 4 years later, I found that the reflex for fear was still in me. But it had become an old familiar, and I had learned things during my absence. I now knew how to control myself, to check myself, to put on an act even while scared, angry, or desperate. And so I was able to listen to the sounds in the dark with a calm mind for the first time. First, the rustling. Mice, they had said. Wrong. It was the scratching of long talons along the board behind my bed. The creature in the walls had never left, even while I had been gone. It had missed me. It had waited for me. I knew what would come next. I braced for it. I was unable to hide under my covers, to cry, or to shiver. I was frozen in my childhood bed, and then there it came. The sound I was able to describe too well. It was the sound of footsteps. 4 years ago it had sent me into crying fits in the middle of the night. I had fled from my room every night, and my agonized screams roused my father, my teacher, the servants, every breathing being in the house. A man's footfall. The people who had been called in to help when my father still pretended to believe me had asked with their patronizing sneers. No, I had been eager to explain, feeling listened to. Softer, like a person who is not wearing shoes. You are reporting somebody on bare feet pattering around inside the wall behind your bed. Maybe that was the moment I had started to realize that I was not being listened to, that I was already merely being checked for symptoms of some illness of the mind. I can now imagine how they must have said to each other, "Vivid imagination. Didn't the girl get a glimpse of her mother's body? A drowned body. That's a sight that even some grown men might not digest easily." I imagined their sonorous laughter before their conversation would have moved on to more entertaining matters. Now, older and wiser, I lay awake in my bed again, waiting for the distinct sound of bare, wet feet in my wall. This time, I was not going to flee. I was going to meet this evil thing. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I sneered. I felt my upper lip lifting, baring my teeth, like an animal. I knew with certainty what was in my wall. It was whatever malevolent presence had possessed my mother to take her own life in those dark and angry waves. They could take away my books to cure my active imagination, but they could never take away the stories I created in my head. And now, I thought triumphantly, it was coming for me. It would walk me down to the water, and then they would see that I had attempted to tell the truth all along. And whoever would see my body, bloated, gnawed by fish, white and blue and green, would be haunted too. I lay there in my dark room, immobile and sneering with anticipation or terror, as the sounds of the wet footsteps inside the wall grew louder and ever louder, closer, so close now. The curtain around my bed did nothing to alleviate the freezing cold of the North Sea waters that had intruded. The demon was there now, in the room, just like I had always feared. 2 more taps of those wet paws on the wooden floor. The bed curtain moved as if by a breeze brought in from the sea. It billowed slightly, then sagged again. The demon moved around me to check for the best way to get to me, to access my soul. It had grown brave in the past 4 years, but I had grown less frightened too. They never believed me, I hissed under my breath, and finally I was able to reach for the bed curtain. With all my weak might I tore the curtain away to face the haunting presence. The creature's hollow, waxen face glared at me, and there was a fire in its dead eyes that I hadn't seen there back when I found her, washed up on the beach, not far from the cliff from which she had flung herself. The wax-like eyes of my mother's dead body had haunted me the most. A passionate fury burnt in those eyes now, as if she had wandered the seas of Europe and brought back a glow of Baltic amber. She glared and opened her frayed mouth, gnawed wider by fishes, and let out a moan so chilling that it nearly sent me back into my frightened paralysis. But I kept my eyes open. I kept my body unmoving, just like I had practiced for 4 years, and I looked at her distorted, destroyed face. Her hair, icy white from the wintry seas and laced with seaweed, hung in wet rags to her waist. She was still in her nightgown, that white lace nightgown. Her chilly fingers reached out to me. They dripped a wet trail on my bed, on me, so cold it burnt. I wanted to grasp her dear, dear hands in mine, to breathe warmth on her, to warm her up again after all those years in the icy sea and all those years haunting this icy house. But my hands passed through her as if through water. "Mother," I said, glad nevertheless. "Dear." Her voice came hoarse and gurgling, a painful strain. I could hear the effort it took. "You." She brought out word by hissing and rolling word. "Came back." I nodded next to her frozen presence. "But why did you?" I asked, and a new emotion rolled through me, one of bottomless grief and pain. "To tell you," the ocean in her crashed and gurgled, "that he killed me." I gasped. I was shivering now. She tried to withdraw. She didn't want to cause me pain. She had had to deliver her message. I had always been too frightened to listen. "Two," she began again, with renewed strength after her first confession. "Tell her that he will kill again." "Two," it pained me to hear her struggle so much. "Tell you that this house is not haunted by me, but by him." I couldn't help myself then, and I cried. All those condescending doctors, and along with them, ready to agree, inconvenienced, dismissive, always my father. My father, always abroad, always travelling, always interested in the more delicate, the more modern, the younger. "You've come to warn her?" I repeated. When she moved her head from side to side, shaking her head, ocean spray speckled my face. "I can only haunt you," she said, sounding stronger by the minute. "But I've come to ask you to take revenge for me and to rescue her." There was not a doubt on my mind. I slipped out of my bed. I led the icy presence of my long-dead mother through the halls of the house. I stepped quietly, so as not to disturb anyone except for the right person. I found my stepmother in the study adjacent to her bedroom. She sat at her desk by lamplight. Her forehead was cradled in her hand. I recognized a shudder of a stifled sob, followed by a shudder caused by the cold sea wind that had suddenly entered her room. She dissolved her posture of tired despair and turned around to me. Seemliness dictated that she clean herself up and not let her tears show to her frail stepdaughter. "Oh," she sighed. It took her a moment to pull herself together before she managed to scold me for roaming the hallways late at night when I was under strict orders to rest. "Mother," I said, and meant the woman who had died, not the woman who had risen from her writing desk, disturbed in her distress and helpless against my late-night rebellion. When the icy sea breeze drew closer and the fraying spectre entered her study, I witnessed my stepmother, Blanche. I witnessed her every reaction, and I sneered again, relieved to see my own terror of years finally reflected in someone else's visceral reaction to the haunting injustice. "This is my mother," I introduced them, calmly. My stepmother had shrunk away. She was whimpering now, her back to her desk, as unable as I had been to tear my eyes away from the drowned body. My stepmother's eyes, huge and brimming with tears, were fixed on the ghost who was a steadying presence behind me. "We have come to save your life," I said, the power behind me making me feel strong for the first time in my life. My stepmother's lip began to quiver. Her hands, that had been clasped tight under her chin, loosened. Her posture sagged. "He killed you," she said to my mother's presence, evenly now. She was a smart woman, I thought. She had collected clues, I assumed, over the past 4 years. "He killed you because he wanted me. Will you join us?" I invited her. I recognized a liberating grin, probably similar to my own, on my stepmother's face when she agreed. "But wear your heavy boots," the ghost of my mother spoke, just like he did that night when he took me out to the cliff. "So he will hear us coming. He will know we are coming for him."
I wasn't expecting that ending. I love that it turns into a sort of revenge story. And of course, we couldn't have an episode on psychological horror without paying our respects to one of the greats. So our next story is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, a story that was first published in 1843 but can be found in our book American Gothic Short Stories. This is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye for ever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, and with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. Every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it in slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ah, would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I boldly went into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in the opening of the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there was I, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you might think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket that has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple, dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. But have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbour. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I had dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall, and at length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I made the end of these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as the officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house, and bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat, and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I rose and argued about the trifles. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I rose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God! What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise rose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard it not? Almighty God, no, no! They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, hark! Louder! 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 Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart.
He is just the master of Gothic literature. I guess then that these stories beg the question, can an imagination ever be too active? And to what degree should we as readers place our trust in these unreliable narrators? A big thank you to our authors and narrators. If you want to read more stories like these ones, be sure to look at the rest of the stories in our American Gothic and Footsteps in the Dark short story collections, or perhaps any of our other horror titles for that matter.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast. We look forward to the next one, and please remember to recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.